Thunder rolled across the marble sky of Rome, its echoes trapped within the stone corridors of the imperial palace. Senator Marcus Claudius stood frozen, the torch in his hand trembling though he tried to hold it steady. The flames spat and hissed, casting distorted shadows across polished columns, while behind the oak doors his 14-year-old daughter disappeared into darkness. Other fathers lined the corridor in silence, each clutching their own flame like condemned men awaiting execution. They weren't protectors here, they were witnesses, turned into instruments of their daughter's destruction, and somewhere in the alcoves, a scribe's quill scratched with mechanical precision, turning screams into numbers, children into entries on a ledger. This was not random cruelty. It was systematized, orchestrated, rehearsed evil dressed in purple silk and stamped with imperial authority. And the question that hangs over history is unbearable. How could Rome, master of law and empire, descend into such industrialized horror, where fathers became accomplices and daughters became inventory? To understand that night, to understand how an emperor transformed intimacy into state policy, we must travel back to the beginning, back to the moment when Caligula first stepped into power, carrying with him both the promise of salvation and the seeds of Rome's darkest machinery. But before we dive deeper into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more journeys into the shadows of the past, and please, leave a comment below to let me know where in the world you are listening from. I find it almost unbelievable that together, across time and space, we are connected by the same curiosity for the past. Thank you for being here. And now let us return to the year 37 CE, to the death of an emperor and the birth of something Rome would never recover from. The year was 37 CE. The old Emperor Tiberius lay dying on the island of Capri, his breath rattling like dice shaken in a gambler's cup, for 23 years. Rome had lived under his shadow a reign of suspicion, exile, and sudden executions. Senators spoke in whispers, citizens avoided glances, and the empire's heartbeat slowed under the weight of his paranoia. His death was not just the end of a man, it was the exhalation of an entire nation. When news spread that Tiberius had taken his final breath, relief erupted like a festival. Bells tolled in temples, merchants poured wine into the streets, and strangers embraced as though freed from invisible chains. The Senate rejoiced most of all. For into this vacuum of dread stepped a young man they believed destined to restore dignity, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula. He was only 24, but Rome adored him before he had even spoken a word as emperor, the son of Germanicus, the beloved general who had once seemed poised to inherit the empire. Caligula carried the glow of his father's legend. As a child, he had walked among the legions in miniature armor, earning the nickname Little Boots. Soldiers adored him, the common people adored him, and even senators, weary of fear, dared to hope again. In those first days, hope seemed justified. Caligula's public acts glittered with generosity. He ordered tax cuts for struggling citizens, distributed bonuses to the army, and declared days of gladiatorial games so lavish they rivaled anything Rome had seen before. The amphitheatres thundered with cheers, the Circus Maximus overflowed with chariots and banners, and Rome, long starved of joy, feasted on spectacle. Coins were minted with his youthful profile, his sharp jaw and wide eyes stamped into bronze that spread across the empire like promises made solid. In the forum, senators whispered with cautious optimism, "At last, the grandson of Augustus himself sits on the throne," one muttered, and with him, perhaps, a return to Roman dignity. But beneath the marble sheen of his public smile, darker ripples stirred. In the palace, slaves began to vanish. A kitchen maid missed her morning duties, then 2 stable boys disappeared. At first, their overseers assumed escape, but when the Tiber River carried their bodies back to the city, marked with wounds even hardened soldiers hesitated to describe, unease threaded through the whispers of servants. Still, Rome looked away. It was easier to cling to hope than to face shadows so soon. Power, after all, does not always reveal itself in a thunderclap. Sometimes it slides quietly into place, subtle as a blade pressed against the skin. For Caligula, that blade sharpened in October of the same year, only 6 months into his reign. He fell suddenly and violently ill. Fever consumed him, shaking his body with such violence that physicians doubted he would live. Rome held its breath in dread, as if the gods had placed their chosen saviour on the edge of the abyss. Prayers rose from every temple. Pilgrims thronged to altars, sacrificing oxen, lambs, anything to save their young emperor. Citizens wept in the streets, begging Jupiter, Apollo, even foreign gods for mercy. After weeks of suspense, Caligula staggered back from the brink. His recovery was hailed as a miracle. The city erupted with thanksgiving, sacrifices, and songs. He rode through the streets again, pale but alive, greeted by a populace convinced they had witnessed divine favour. Yet those closest to him noticed something unearthly in his gaze. His eyes burned too brightly, his smile lingered too long, and his laughter rang hollow in marble halls. He returned different, wrote the historian Suetonius. To the Senate, he was a young man healed, but to the palace slaves, to the guards who served him, it seemed as if something had been burned away in the fever, something human. That was when the whispers changed. The serving girl Claudia vanished and did not return. Then a noble boy assigned as a page was reassigned to special service, never seen outside the palace again. Those who had thought illness might soften him soon realized it had done the opposite. Caligula had gazed into death and decided he was its conqueror. He began to speak less like a man and more like a god. If mortal laws no longer bound him, then neither did mortal boundaries. He returned not just alive, but reborn with the certainty that he was divine, and with that conviction. His appetites no longer needed hiding. The senators who had cheered his recovery had no idea that this fever had birthed the Rome they would come to fear. Because it was after that illness that the emperor's smile began to curdle. His promises of generosity turned into demands for obedience, and his pleasures once private started creeping into public life. What Rome celebrated as salvation was, in truth, the opening note of a symphony of horror. For a brief moment, it seemed the gods had given Rome not only a new emperor, but a golden age. Caligula's return from illness was framed as divine proof of his destiny. The city erupted with celebrations, torchlit processions wound through the forum. Musicians played in taverns until dawn, and citizens shouted blessings to their young ruler as if he were a god already ascended. He fed this worship with calculated gestures. He abolished some of the most hated taxes, restored banished exiles to their homes, and lavished games upon the people. Gladiators spilled blood for days in arenas as the crowd roared his name. Chariots thundered in the Circus Maximus, their wheels kicking up dust as banners of every faction whipped in the wind. Vendors shouted, dice rattled in gamblers' hands, wine spilled onto cobblestones. Rome felt alive again. For the soldiers, he was equally generous. Bonuses filled their purses, promotions flowed easily, and discipline relaxed. Veterans who had grown old under Tiberius's suspicion now toasted their new commander with relief. In the Senate, men who had once spoken in whispers dared to speak more boldly. "This is the son of Germanicus," they told themselves, "a true Roman prince, blessed by Jupiter himself." But beneath the music and wine, the shadows deepened. Servants still disappeared sometimes without a trace, sometimes resurfacing in the river with faces mutilated into silence. Rumours curled like smoke through the palace corridors, whispers of pleasures that grew stranger, darker, more elaborate. A kitchen slave vanished after spilling wine at a banquet. A serving girl disappeared the same week she was noticed for her beauty. When questions arose, the explanations were always neat, rehearsed. She fled the city. He stole from the treasury. But guards who had carried the bodies out at night knew otherwise. Their eyes betrayed what their mouths could never say. The emperor's games did not end in the arena. Still, Rome clung to its illusion. Better to believe in divine favour than face the abyss. Citizens told themselves he was young, that he was testing boundaries, that power would temper him with time. Had not every emperor before him indulged in excess? Was it not the privilege of Caesar to live above ordinary law? But there was a difference between indulgence and transformation. Caligula's appetite was not a passing weakness. It was a structure being built stone by stone, quill by quill, body by body. The palace itself began to change under his orders. Architects received peculiar requests, chambers with strange acoustic properties, windows designed for observation, sconces positioned at precise heights. Workers puzzled over these commands. not knowing they were laying the foundations for future torment. To those who watched closely, it was as if Rome itself was being rescripted. Public joy hid private terror, and behind the shimmering facade of generosity, the emperor was already reshaping intimacy into policy, pleasure into procedure. And then came the fever-bright revelation he no longer saw himself as mortal. "The gods spared me," he declared, his voice echoing across the Senate chamber. "I returned because I am divine." The senators applauded. What else could they do but behind their smiles? Many felt the first tremor of dread, because when a man believes himself a god, mortal rules no longer matter, and Rome was about to discover what happens when an entire empire becomes the stage for one man's divinity. The cracks began quietly, almost invisibly, like hairline fractures in marble. At first, only those closest to the palace noticed the absence of a familiar servant, the strange silence in kitchens where laughter once spilled with clattering pots. A girl named Claudia, barely 17, failed to appear for morning duties days later. A kitchen slave vanished mid-shift. Their overseer muttered about desertion, but when bloated corpses surfaced in the Tiber, their wounds told another story. Even hardened soldiers turned pale at the sight. Yet Rome averted its eyes. The Senate still glowed with relief. The people still adored their emperor, and the new prosperity drowned doubt in wine and gold. Who would dare question the son of Germanicus? Who would shatter the fragile illusion of salvation? The first signs reached deeper than missing slaves. Invitations began to arrive hand-delivered by Praetorian guards, sealed with imperial wax. They were addressed to senators' wives, to noble daughters, to young boys plucked from Rome's most prestigious families. Private dinners with the emperor, the parchment read. The words glittered with honor, but behind closed doors, honor dissolved into something darker. The women returned pale, silent, their eyes fixed on nothing. The boys emerged powdered and perfumed, clothed in silks that mocked their youth, but none dared speak. Silence was survival, and in silence, the rot spread. Still, the Senate convinced itself to look away. "He is young," they whispered. "He tests boundaries. He will mature." It was easier to excuse than to confront, easier to believe the emperor's indulgence was temporary than to admit it was evolving into something permanent. Behind the velvet curtains of the palace, however, permanence was exactly what Caligula sought. He replaced the palace guard with men selected not for loyalty but for cruelty. He appointed a freedman named Helicon as his master of pleasures, a man whose entire survival depended on anticipating and supplying whatever twisted novelty the emperor demanded. Helicon worked with bureaucratic precision. He understood Rome's machinery of order, how ledgers managed grain shipments, how census lists tracked populations, how scrolls of military ranks preserved discipline. He adapted this system to the emperor's desires. At first, the records were sporadic, scribbled notes of a merchant's daughter or a senator's wife, but soon they hardened into ledgers, bound and catalogued with the same care Rome devoted to aqueducts and legions. The entries began to look eerily familiar, echoing the language of commerce acquisition, assignment, processing, human lives reduced to transactions, recorded with the same detachment as cargo or coin. And in this cold arithmetic, Caligula discovered something intoxicating. Pleasure was fleeting, power was fragile, but documentation gave eternity. If his acts were written, counted, stamped with imperial authority, then even the gods themselves could not erase them. By the summer of 38 CE, the transformation was undeniable. What had begun as private indulgence was becoming policy. The palace no longer functioned merely as the emperor's home, it was becoming a factory of humiliation, and every father in Rome would soon learn that no family was beyond its reach. By the opening months of 39 CE, indulgence had hardened into architecture. The palace itself became a blueprint of cruelty. Architects were summoned at odd hours, handed sketches drawn not for beauty or defence, but for humiliation. They were instructed to build chambers with unusual acoustic properties, so that every cry could travel through hidden corridors. Windows were cut at precise angles not to let in light, but to ensure perfect sight lines for unwanted witnesses. Torch holders were mounted at measured heights, positioned so that fathers would be forced to illuminate what they most longed to conceal. The workmen did not understand, not at first. They grumbled about strange orders, about wasting marble on odd archways, about designs that served no practical function, but payment flowed richly, and questions were dangerous. One architect, realizing the true purpose of his designs, took his own life rather than see them used. His replacement understood what silence was worth. Meanwhile, the language of the empire shifted. What had once been whispers of indulgence became procedure. Helicon's ledgers multiplied bound volumes filled with entries, each name numbered, each acquisition carefully dated and cross-referenced. The careful documentation gave the illusion of legitimacy. The Senate, so accustomed to bureaucracy, could almost trick itself into believing these were not human beings but resources, managed like grain reserves or provincial taxes. And so the personal perversities of one man became the administrative duties of an empire. The first to suffer were political enemies. A senator who voted against the emperor's tax proposal found his daughter's name inked into the ledger days later. A general who questioned a campaign strategy saw his household quietly dismantled. Wife and children absorbed into the palace machinery. The punishments were calculated not swift death, but slow corrosion, engineered humiliation that bled families dry of dignity while keeping them technically alive. Caligula understood something dreadful about power killing an enemy ended resistance, but breaking him ensured obedience, and nothing broke a man more completely than forcing him to watch the destruction of what he loved. The Senate began to tremble, but still it complied. In Rome, law was process, and once cruelty became process, it began to look like order. The ledgers themselves made horror seem routine. Each page was the mask of normality ink that disguised screams, columns that turned daughters into statistics. Thus began the transition Rome would never recover from private appetite refined into public institution, indulgence transformed into policy. And soon, the emperor would demonstrate this newfound authority not on strangers, but on those who should have been untouchable his own blood. The banquet hall shimmered with oil lamps, their flames mirrored on polished bronze platters and golden goblets. Senators reclined on couches arranged in perfect symmetry, their wives seated beside them, musicians plucking lyres to fill the silence with something almost human. It was a feast meant to display Rome's grandeur. Instead, it became the stage for sacrilege. Caligula entered draped in imperial purple, his eyes fever-bright, his smile stretched too wide. At his side sat Drusilla, his sister, the one he called his equal, the one palace slaves whispered about with unease as he raised his cup to the assembly. A hush fell over 300 senators. They expected flattery, perhaps a boast about gladiatorial games, perhaps a jest at some rival's expense. What they received was the undoing of Rome's moral order, in full view of the empire's most powerful men. Caligula reached for Drusilla with a familiarity that silenced the hall. His hand lingered where no brother's hand should. His lips brushed her ear as if speaking to a wife. Drusilla sat motionless, her face carefully carved into emptiness. The mask of someone who knew resistance was death. At the far side of the table, their other sisters, Julia Livilla and Agrippina the Younger, stared fixedly into their wine, willing themselves to vanish. They understood too well tonight it was Drusilla, but their turn would come. "My divine sisters," Caligula proclaimed, his voice carrying above the crackle of lamps, "blessed by Jupiter himself to share my affection, as Juno shares his." The senators froze. The comparison was unmistakable. In Roman mythology, Jupiter, king of the gods, had taken his own sister Juno as his consort by invoking the precedent of heaven. Caligula transformed taboo into ritual. Now the Senate faced an impossible choice. To object was treason, punishable by death not just for oneself but for one's family. To remain silent was complicity. And so, one by one, hands clapped together, applause filling the hall like rain on marble roofs. The sound was thin, brittle, a symphony of men applauding their own defeat. Drusilla's stillness was its own kind of survival. Julia Livilla tried to resist at first, her gaze sharp. Her posture rigid, but she was swiftly broken by public humiliation that left scars deeper than lashes. Agrippina, cleverer, chose another path. She smiled faintly, storing every humiliation in the vault of memory, a debt she intended one day to repay. What happened that night was not merely a private obscenity. It was a message carved into the bones of the Republic's last guardians. If the emperor could desecrate his own blood in their presence, what hope did their families have if they applauded this? What would they not applaud? The Senate, once the guardian of Roman virtue, had become an audience in the theatre of degradation. Each cheer, each forced smile, was another brick in the structure of complicity. Silence had metastasized into obedience. And so, with one gesture at a banquet, Caligula broke not just social custom, but the sacred concept of family itself. Rome would never look at fathers, brothers, or daughters the same way again. From that banquet onward, Drusilla ceased to be merely Caligula's sister. She became his chosen, his shadow queen, his living goddess. Palace corridors whispered her name as though it carried both blessing and curse. Servants learned to bow when she passed, not because she was sister to the emperor, but because he had declared her divine. "She shares my divinity," Caligula announced. Moving her into the palace chambers once reserved for empresses and wives, her husband, Lucius Cassius Longinus, was dispatched to a distant governorship and exile dressed as promotion. It was a mercy compared to what awaited future husbands of Caligula's sisters. At audiences with senators, Drusilla sat beside him, silent and pale, her presence a visible reminder of what the emperor could command. At religious ceremonies, she stood at his side, forced to enact rituals that mocked every Roman virtue, and at evening banquets, her body became theatre both symbol and spectacle. To some senators, the humiliation was unbearable, yet they clapped, smiled, and toasted. Their silence transformed into applause. Each performance made them more complicit, more broken, for if they dared whisper of outrage, they knew the torches might one day be placed in their own hands. Drusilla's survival strategy was numbness. She learned to still her features, to extinguish any flicker of the self that might betray horror or resistance. She became the hollow vessel her brother required, a mask of obedience hiding a human spirit sinking beneath the weight of inevitability. Julia Livilla, her younger sister, tried to resist. She argued, pleaded, attempted to avoid the summons, but her punishment was swift and public, a spectacle designed to crush even the thought of defiance. Agrippina, sharper than both, watched carefully, committing every detail to memory: the guards who enforced the rituals, the officials who wrote the ledgers, the senators who smiled through their shame. One day, she swore, these names would matter. Meanwhile, Caligula's obsession deepened. He began to refer to Drusilla not as sister, but as wife of his soul, goddess of his blood, when he fell sick again. It was Drusilla alone who was permitted to tend to him, her presence in his chamber reinforcing her role as both caretaker and captive. Letters from Marcus Lepidus, Drusilla's fiancé before Caligula claimed her, survive in fragments centuries later. They reveal the silent collapse of a man who chose survival over honour. I smile, I nod, I pretend not to see. What else can a mortal man do when gods play their games? This was Caligula's genius to twist not only flesh but loyalty, to force the powerful into silence by making them witnesses. Every senator, every guard, every servant who saw Drusilla treated as consort understood the warning. If he could desecrate his own sister, what could he not do to theirs? Rome's values had been inverted. Family bonds once sacred, the foundation of a Roman society, were shattered under the weight of divine whim, and in Drusilla's pale stillness, Rome glimpsed its own reflection, a civilization too paralyzed to resist, learning to worship what it once condemned. By the summer of 38 CE, the palace whispered of Drusilla's swelling form. Her body carried the unmistakable signs of pregnancy, and Caligula did nothing to conceal it. Instead, he proclaimed it as a miracle. "She bears a god," he declared before the Senate, his voice resounding in the marble chamber. "Our child will rule heaven and earth." The words, blasphemous and obscene, were received with thunderous applause, not because senators believed them, but because disbelief was death. Priests were summoned to bless the unborn, sacrifices bled across temple altars, and entire provinces were ordered to pray for the health of a child conceived in desecration. Drusilla walked through these rituals like a ghost, in her silence. She carried not only the weight of life but the crushing burden of being both sister and consort, victim and goddess. She never spoke publicly of her condition. She never would. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. In June of that year, Drusilla was gone. The official word was illness, complications of childbirth. Perhaps others whispered poison, administered by those within the palace who feared what her child might represent. whatever the cause. Her death shattered something inside Caligula that could never be repaired. His grief was not the grief of a brother. It was the convulsion of a man who believed he had lost half his divinity. He refused to treat her passing as mortal. Instead, he commanded Rome to worship her as a goddess. Temples rose in her honor. Statues carved in marble bore her likeness, robed like Venus, crowned like Juno. Oaths of loyalty to the emperor now had to be sworn by Drusilla's divinity. Citizens who once whispered her name in pity now invoked it in prayer. Forced to kneel before the image of a girl whose suffering had been paraded as sacred, Rome's religion, once a patchwork of myths and rituals, now bent under the weight of a crime immortalized as theology. But grief did not soften Caligula. It sharpened him. The loss of Drusilla became a license for new cruelties. Julia, Livilla, and Agrippina, still alive, were now ordered to take their dead sister's place. They were dressed in her clothes, made to speak in her voice, compelled to embody her during ceremonies that mocked the very essence of family. The horror was no longer physical alone, it was psychological, spiritual, corrosive to the soul. To refuse meant death. To comply meant living as the shadow of a dead sister, carrying her memory not as comfort but as weapon. The impossible choice broke something fundamental in Rome's understanding of blood, loyalty, and love. What Rome now witnessed was more than decadence. It was the rewriting of kinship itself. By declaring his sister a goddess and forcing her siblings to impersonate her, Caligula had done what no enemy army ever could. He had corrupted the Roman family, the sacred foundation of the empire. The Senate applauded, the priests bowed, and in the marble silence of the forum, fathers held their daughters closer, wondering how long before their names appeared in the emperor's ledgers. Because Drusilla's death had not ended the machinery of abuse, it had only intensified it, and in the shadows of her temples, the quills of imperial scribes continued scratching, reducing women to entries, families to figures, humanity to ink. The scratch of quills became the soundtrack of Rome's descent. In chambers lit not by torches of fathers, but by rows of oil lamps, scribes bent over parchment, recording names with mechanical precision. At the head of this operation stood Sabinus, the master of imperial accounts, a man trained not in cruelty but in arithmetic. For him, numbers were truth, columns were order, and everything grain, coin, or flesh could be balanced on a ledger. He did not need to raise a sword or spill blood. His weapon was ink, his battlefield was parchment, and with each stroke of his quill, humanity drained into abstraction. The language of his books was chilling in its banality. Acquisition a daughter dragged screaming from her villa, processing a week of isolation, deprivation, and indoctrination. Divine service submission in chambers where oil lamps burned and witnesses were forced to watch, stripped of names, reduced to categories. These victims were not people but items, managed with the same detachment as tax revenues or wheat shipments from Africa. Sabinus's ledgers revealed patterns. Victims were logged by age, origin, family status, and compliance rating. A senator's daughter might be listed alongside notes on her father's voting record. A merchant's wife could appear with a marginal comment on her husband's debts. The system was not random, it was targeted, designed to turn opposition into obedience by converting families into hostages. By 39 CE, the numbers told their own story. 300 women, 300 boys, exact figures. As if quotas had been set like military recruitment, the emperor had transformed depravity into industry, applying Rome's genius for organization not to aqueducts or roads, but to the systematic breaking of human spirits. And the ledgers did more than record. They legitimized. Once entered into Sabinus's scrolls, a woman ceased to exist in the eyes of law or family. She became property, stamped with imperial authority, her fate as irreversible as a tax levy. A senator could protest his daughter's abduction. But when shown her entry in the ledger, her name inked beside a number, his words shriveled in his throat. Against documentation, even grief seemed powerless. The cold efficiency of the system shocked even seasoned bureaucrats. Marginal notes read like the commentary of merchants discussing cargo recommend increase in younger acquisitions before festival season. Exceptional return from Senator Fabius's wife. Seek similar profiles. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Roman virtue. Every line a reminder that atrocity can wear the mask of administration. Some of these ledgers, charred at the edges yet still legible, would be discovered centuries later in palace ruins. Scholars would handle them with trembling hands, realizing they were not merely records but tombstones, each entry a grave for a living soul. And in their pages, Rome's true horror became clear. The empire had not simply tolerated Caligula's appetites, it had documented them, institutionalized them, given them permanence. Evil had been transformed into policy, and paper had made it eternal. Rome had always been a civilization of systems. Its roads stretched like veins across continents. Its aqueducts poured life into cities. Its armies marched with mechanical precision. Now, under Caligula, that same genius for structure was redirected into darkness. What had once built empire now built atrocity. Helicon's procurement network spread like roots beneath the marble surface of the city. Informants were posted in markets and forums, listening for whispers of opposition. Scouts noted the age and beauty of daughters glimpsed at festivals. Strike teams of guards moved swiftly and without warning, dragging victims from homes before families could react. Each stage of the process was documented, reviewed, optimized. The entries in Sabinus's ledgers became more detailed, more systematic, no longer a list of names. They now contained columns: age, height, family origin, compliance score, revenue potential. Each victim was an equation to be solved, an asset to be maximized. Orientation week became a ritual of breaking. New acquisitions were isolated from their families, stripped of familiar clothing, denied food or sleep until disoriented. They were forced to witness others in submission lessons written not in words but in screams. By the seventh day, most understood resistance was useless. For those who did not, retraining awaited harsher deprivation, calculated humiliation, the kind of torment designed to extinguish even the smallest spark of self. Survivors left behind fragments of testimony, carved into stone or scratched into plaster when guards weren't watching. One fragment, later uncovered beneath collapsed walls, read day 4. I no longer count the hours. I recite verses to remember who I am, though the words blur when the screams begin. If I forget, I cease to exist. Another voice, etched faintly into marble, whispered the despair of systematized abuse. We are not people here. We are entries. We are numbers. We are what the ink says we are. The conditioning extended beyond physical control. Victims were given false choices designed to mimic autonomy, comply, and receive an extra ration of bread. Resist and endure a night without water. Small mercies became shackles. By manipulating reward and punishment, overseers transformed survival itself into complicity. And all of it, every hour of deprivation, every broken cry, every scribbled mark was preserved. Duplicates of records were filed for the permanent archives, because Caligula demanded eternity for his machinery. Rome could not forget what was written, and in the emperor's madness, permanence was the truest form of power. The empire had industrialized cruelty. What tyrants before had done impulsively seizing women, humiliating enemies, indulging in private lusts, Caligula transformed into infrastructure. Departments managed procurement, schedules organized processing, quality control assessed compliance, reports measured efficiency. Human beings were not only destroyed, they were managed, optimized, consumed by a machine designed to run forever. And in that efficiency lay the deepest horror, the realization that Rome, proud mother of laws and order, had allowed its greatest strength organization to become its most terrifying weapon. The inspection chamber was long and narrow, its marble floor polished to a mirror sheen that forced every new arrival to see herself reflected in trembling detail. Torches lined the walls at precise intervals, not for grandeur but for clarity, ensuring scribes could record every scar, every hesitation, every tear. One by one, women were summoned forward. Their names and lineages were demanded in voices as sharp as whips. State your family, state your origin. Each syllable was inked into ledgers, the scratch of quills drowning out the sound of muffled sobs. To the scribes, they were not wives, mothers, or daughters. They were entries waiting for classification. Behind iron bars at the end of the hall, husbands and fathers were forced to watch. Senators who once debated policies in the forum now stood like prisoners, their eyes hollow as their wives or daughters were appraised like cattle. To protest would not save them, it would only ensure their younger children were added to the next month's list. Silence became survival, but silence corroded the soul. The process unfolded with mechanical efficiency. A woman stepped forward. Her age was recorded, her health inspected, her skills questioned. Could she read? Could she calculate sums? Did she sing, play instruments, manage a household? Each answer determined her fate, written not in destiny but in ink. Those fluent in multiple languages were tagged for translation duties. Those trained in mathematics might be sent to accounting. But most were marked for general service, a euphemism as chilling as it was vague. Beauty and youth, though never stated outright, carried their own classification premium. The categories were merciless. Premium meant direct imperial service, personal use by the emperor or his closest circle. Standard meant palace duties, public and private, ranging from banquets to ceremonies. Utility was the harshest fate, assigned to older women or those considered less useful manual labour. Endless drudgery, or duties that broke the body in silence. When Livia Secunda, the daughter of a mid-ranking senator, showed defiance during questioning, she was seized by guards. The scribe's hand did not falter, correction required for resistance. Her screams echoed from the adjoining chamber as the next woman stepped forward, learning in that instant that defiance carried only one reward: public agony. Fathers clutched the bars until their knuckles whitened, torn between shame and helplessness. To look away was impossible. Guards forced their gaze forward. To watch was unbearable. Every cry felt like a wound inflicted on their own flesh. Many wept silently, their tears unnoticed in the clamour of ink and command. But the worst cruelty lay not in the questions or the inspections, it lay in the ledger's cold rankings. At the end of each evaluation, a grade was assigned: a senator's wife, her dignity shredded, might be recorded as utility; a young bride, still wearing her marriage band, might be branded premium. With those single words, their futures collapsed into categories from which there was no escape. When the assessments ended, the women were led away in silence, their profiles duplicated for the archives, ensuring anonymity could never protect them. 30 entered the chamber that day as Roman matrons. 30 left as inventory items, their humanity reduced to columns of description, their fates sealed with ink. And the fathers' men who once commanded armies, debated laws, governed provinces, left with nothing but the memory of watching their families turned into statistics, powerless as their legacies dissolved into ledgers. At the eastern wing of the palace, the marble walls were remade into something grotesque. Where once had stood galleries of art and gardens perfumed with laurel, now rose the so-called Temple of Divine Service. To approach it was to walk through an illusion, a sacred facade masking systematic degradation. Statues of Roman goddesses flanked the entrance, their faces deliberately recarved to resemble the women forced to serve within. Incense filled the air, cloaking the corridors in a perfumed haze meant to disguise the odour of fear and exhaustion. Priests in ceremonial garb moved about with mechanical obedience, greeting visitors as if they approached a holy rite. But the rites performed here mocked everything Rome once held sacred. Appointments were scheduled with military precision. Tokens carved from ivory were handed out, each inscribed with the hour and chamber number. Senators seeking imperial favour clutched them like lifelines, knowing their careers and their families' survival depended on presenting themselves at the appointed time. A grain merchant hoping for tax relief, a general desiring promotion, a provincial governor desperate to avoid suspicion, all passed through the temple's gates under the pretence of piety. Inside, the chambers glittered with false luxury silk cushions, golden lamps, frescoes of Venus and Apollo. But no gold could disguise the truth. The women waiting within had been stripped of dignity, their bodies costumed in ways that parodied their former lives, matrons dressed as priestesses, brides adorned like courtesans, daughters presented as living offerings. One wall still bore a scratched testimony later uncovered by archaeologists' 4th week of service. 12 appointments daily. I recite poetry to remain myself. Cornelia died yesterday. They made us watch her burial to remind us what happens to those who break. The pricing system revealed the coldest calculation of all. Premium appointments, those with the youngest or most beautiful, cost 500 denarii, more than a soldier earned in a year. Standard rates hovered around 200. Discounts existed for frequent visitors. There were even festival packages, encouraging higher traffic during public holidays. It was commerce in its purest, ugliest form, the commodification of human dignity. And yet the genius of the system lay not only in profit, but in complicity. Each client was required to sign a record of his visit, a document filed in duplicate one for immediate use, another for the archives. These files became chains. A senator who enjoyed the emperor's divine temple could never later oppose him. For proof of his participation waited in the archives, ready to be unrolled in the forum if rebellion stirred. Thus, shame itself became a currency of control. Rome's most powerful men were bound to silence not by loyalty, but by blackmail. The temple generated staggering revenue, 50,000 denarii monthly, more than the treasury of many provinces. Caligula reviewed the figures personally, demanding longer hours, more women, higher yields. The temple was not merely his playground, it was an engine of profit, discipline, and terror. But the cruelest innovation of all was who he placed in charge. Senator Piso, once a respected statesman, was appointed overseer of divine service. Each day, he scheduled appointments, enforced discipline, and balanced revenues. His own wife served in Chamber 3, his journals, fragments of which survived centuries, tell the story of a man unravelling. Day 47, I assigned Marcellus's wife to the Thracian ambassador. She begged me to remember our children once played together. I had no choice. Day 92, revenues exceed projections. The emperor is pleased. I vomit blood nightly. Day 130, they brought my daughter today, said she was old enough. I scheduled her myself. If I refused, they would have given her to the guards. In that temple, Rome's soul was not merely wounded, it was auctioned, ledgered, and catalogued. What had begun as indulgence had matured into a marketplace of power, where faith was theatre, survival was currency, and the sacred had been twisted into the obscene. The corridor stretched like a wound through the palace, its walls lined with iron sconces spaced at perfect intervals. Each niche was designed to hold a torch. Each torch was meant to be carried not by servants, not by guards, but by fathers. This was Caligula's innovation, the cruelest of all the torch duty. Summons arrived at dawn. Written in cold bureaucratic language, your presence is required for illumination service. Bring your eldest unmarried daughter. Compliance ensures your family's continued prosperity. To refuse was unthinkable. Non-compliance meant annihilation, brothers executed, wives enslaved, younger children distributed among soldiers like spoils of war. The summons did not ask it condemned. On those nights, the corridor filled with men whose hands had once signed decrees, wielded swords, embraced children. Now those same hands held torches, steady flames meant to illuminate their daughters' torment. Fathers were positioned precisely 8 feet from the chamber doors. Guards barked instructions with mechanical detachment torch at shoulder height. No lowering, no extinguishing, eyes forward. Any deviation means your son joins next month's inventory. The architecture ensured cruelty at every level. Small windows cut into the chamber doors provided perfect sight lines. The torches lit every corner of the room, ensuring fathers could see what unfolded, ensuring daughters could see their fathers' helpless faces through the glow. Love was weaponized into torture, protector turned into accomplice. Senator Brutus, once defiant in debates, stood clutching a torch as his daughter's screams carried through the door. Behind him, Flavius the merchant bit his lip until blood ran, praying the flame in his hand would sputter out so he would not have to see. Ahead, General Cassius stood rigid, his military discipline shattered by the sounds no battlefield had ever prepared him for. Some fathers tried to escape into their minds. They recited poetry, calculated sums, whispered prayers to absent gods, anything to create distance. But the sounds always pierced their defences, the ragged breaths, the muffled cries, the silence that fell only when the body gave out. Others broke entirely. One father scratched words into the stone while waiting his turn. We are the damned who breathe, the dead who walk, the fallen who failed our sacred duty. May the gods forgive what emperors compel. And still the line advanced, torch by torch. Each man emerged hollow, his eyes vacant, his flame extinguished. His daughter carried past him as though her body were simply another item processed by the imperial machine. The torch duty poisoned Rome more deeply than any law or decree. Fathers could no longer look at daughters without remembering the night their hands betrayed them. Daughters could no longer look at fathers without seeing the silhouette of a man holding fire steady while innocence was consumed. Families fractured in silence, their bonds corroded by shame that could never be spoken. It was not just personal torment, it was social control. By spreading torch assignments widely today, a rival senator, Tomorrow a loyal ally, Caligula, ensured no one could unite against him. Every man carried his own guilt, every family its own silence. Resistance required solidarity, but solidarity died in corridors lit by fathers' flames. And so the torches burned, week after week, month after month, not only lighting chambers of horror, but illuminating the complete collapse of Rome's moral order. The banquets of Caligula were no longer feasts, they were theatres of humiliation, meticulously staged with the precision of a military campaign. 50 senators reclined on couches arranged around the emperor, their wives beside them, musicians plucking lyres to disguise the dread. Golden platters of roasted meats and overflowing cups of Falernian wine could not mask the truth every man present feared that tonight. It would be his wife summoned behind the curtain. The chamber doors were designed with acoustics in mind, no matter how loudly the lyres played or how deeply the guests drank. The sounds carried whimpers, muffled cries, the rustle of silk forced into movements of despair, and Caligula insisted the conversations continue as if nothing was happening. "Tell us of grain prices," he would say, smiling, while the voice of a senator's wife broke behind him. When the woman returned, dishevelled and pale, Caligula would raise his cup and deliver commentary with cruel casualness. "Adequate," he might declare, though she lacks proper enthusiasm. Then, turning to her husband, he would laugh. "Brutus, perhaps you should provide better training in your household." Brutus smiled. He had to. If his lips faltered, his son might be taken next. So he smiled through the ache in his jaw, through the salt of tears he dared not shed, and raised his own goblet in toast. Survival demanded performance. The emperor was never content with silence. He forced husbands to speak, to critique, to join the charade. "Tell us, Senator, what methods do you employ at home? Perhaps the rest of us may benefit from your wisdom." A man's refusal meant disgrace. His compliance meant self-betrayal. There was no right answer, only the slow erosion of dignity. Sometimes Caligula demanded comparison. "Cassius, you've encountered Brutus's wife at the temple. How does tonight compare? Cassius, trapped between truth and mercy, chose survival, divine one. Perhaps your godly touch awakens what mortal men cannot." The emperor laughed, delighted not with the woman, but with the spectacle of senators devouring one another's pride. The cruelest nights were reserved for variety. Caligula summoned wives in groups of 3, demanding husbands vote on their performances, applauding the winner and condemning the others to repeat their ordeal. Sometimes he chose themes mothers of many children. Newlyweds, women with the same hair colour turning the sacred bonds of family into grotesque parody. The records of these banquets read like scripts, preserved in ledgers alongside names and dates. Guests were listed, performances ranked, commentary preserved. There could be no denial, no forgetting. History itself was made complicit. Some husbands broke in public. Senator Aurelius, his wife's cries echoing across the dining hall, began to laugh uncontrollably. The laughter continued until guards dragged him away. His mind snapped by the absurdity of smiling through horror. Others drowned themselves in wine, drinking until unconscious, though even that risked punishment for disrespect. And when the feast ended, the final act remained gratitude. Husbands stood and thanked the emperor for honouring their wives. Wives, broken and trembling, thanked him for his divine attention. The words came strangled, but they came nonetheless. To falter was to die. Thus, the banquets became rituals of complicity, where every toast was a confession, every smile a surrender. What had once been private violation was now public theatre, woven into the fabric of Roman politics, and in the flicker of oil lamps, Rome's elite applauded their own undoing. It was not enough for Caligula to desecrate women in the shadows of banquet halls or torchlit corridors. His madness reached further, into the realm of design. He wanted more than victims. He wanted offspring children conceived not in love or choice, but in orchestrated violation, documented and catalogued like livestock. Official decrees, written in dry bureaucratic Latin, began to circulate. Certain families of noble standing are hereby honoured with participation in the imperial continuity programme. Selected wives and daughters shall provide their fertility in service of Rome's divine future. To the outside world, it sounded like duty. To those within, it was damnation. The system was methodical. Palaces were divided into chambers resembling clinics more than bedrooms. Midwives and scribes worked side by side, noting cycles, fertility windows, physical compatibility. Women were examined, measured, and prepared. Consent was not requested. Consent was irrelevant. The emperor's seed, or that of men he designated, was to be planted, and the resulting children belonged not to mothers or fathers, but to Rome, or rather, to him. Every stage was logged. Ledger after ledger detailed the acts in sterile phrases: conception attempted, resistance noted, restraints required, outcome pending, in margins. Guards scrawled cruel jokes, as if bureaucratic detachment were not dehumanizing enough. When pregnancies occurred, mothers were sequestered. Their swelling bodies were paraded in festivals as proof of Rome's divine fecundity. Future heirs of greatness, the heralds proclaimed. While the women's faces betrayed only hollow despair, they were displayed as vessels, never as individuals. And when births came, the cruelty deepened. Infants were taken immediately to imperial nurseries. Their mothers granted only brief glimpses before separation. Nurses raised them in collective wards, their lineage reduced to numbers and notes. Infant 47. Strong lungs, born of senatorial line, suitable for military training. Children became assets, not kin. Some were earmarked for soldiering before they could walk. Others were trained for priesthoods, destined to sanctify the very system that birthed them. A few, selected for beauty, were groomed for roles that mirrored the horrors that created them. Thus the cycle fed itself, generation after generation, as though cruelty were Rome's inheritance. Whispers spread of mothers who tried to flee with newborns, clutching infants to their breasts as they ran through alleyways. They were always caught. Punishment was merciless public flogging, followed by forced witnessing of their child's reassignment to another family. The message was clear: no bond of blood was stronger than the emperor's will. The breeding programs left scars that could not heal. Women became strangers to their own bodies, conditioned to see every month's cycle as a ticking clock toward renewed captivity. Men carried shame heavier than chains, knowing their wives bore children who were legally forbidden to call them father. Families dissolved into silence, their hearths emptied of laughter, their tables set with absence. Even Rome itself grew uneasy. What had begun as whispers became murmurs in the Senate. If the emperor can seize our daughters for breeding, if he can claim our sons as his property, what remains of us? Are we fathers or merely keepers of flesh he has not yet taken? Yet none dared voice it aloud, because every senator held a secret ledger, every family a hidden wound, every man a torch once raised. And so the breeding programs continued, each newborn swaddled in silk, each cry echoing as proof that Rome's future was shackled to its emperor's madness. The palace of Caligula had grown silent in its splendor. What once echoed with forced laughter and the shrieks of violated wives now throbbed with whispers of conspiracy. The marble walls seemed to carry unease. Guards, once eager to display their loyalty, now watched one another with eyes that betrayed doubt. Servants moved quickly, keeping their heads bowed lower than ever, as if afraid that even their shadows might betray them. Caligula himself had changed. He no longer walked among men as emperor, but as a god in flesh. He demanded temples in his honor, sacrifices in his name, and even contemplated placing his statue in the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem. His madness had broken all boundaries of Rome's traditions. Senators gritted their teeth behind forced smiles, each insult to their dignity etching hatred deeper into their bones. At his feasts, the cruelty grew unbearable. Where once he mocked, now he scarcely acknowledged his victims. He had grown bored of pain, hungry for spectacle greater than flesh. He spoke of campaigns to the ocean, of wars against Neptune himself. He ordered legions to collect seashells as spoils of war, then mocked them for their obedience. Men who once followed him into battle now followed with clenched jaws, knowing each command was another descent into humiliation. But the final blow was personal. Caligula's breeding programs and nightly abuses had stripped Rome's elite of their last fragments of pride. Senators returned to their homes hollow-eyed, their wives broken, their children branded with shame that no wealth could erase. Survival had once meant silence. Now silence felt like slow suicide. Among the Praetorian Guard, the whispers sharpened into plans. Their commander, Cassius Chaerea, a man Caligula mocked relentlessly, calling him weak, effeminate. Unworthy became the spearhead. Insults that once humiliated him now burned into resolve. He rallied others with quiet fury. Rome does not belong to a god. Rome belongs to men. The plot was woven in shadows, stitched with fear and necessity. They chose the Palatine Games, a festival of theatre and blood, as the stage. While the crowd roared at actors mimicking myths of old, history prepared to write its own tragedy. Caligula, unaware, paraded through the corridors, basking in the adoration of sycophants and the terror of slaves. He paused often to admire himself reflected in polished bronze, whispering prayers not to Jupiter, but to himself. The conspirators tightened their circle. At last, in a narrow passage near the theatre, Cheria struck. His blade cut not just flesh but illusion. Others followed, steel flashing in frenzy, each thrust releasing years of swallowed humiliation. Caligula screamed not as a god, but as a man pierced, gasping, collapsing upon marble steps slick with his own blood. When it was over, the silence was deafening. Rome's monster lay lifeless, his divine mask shattered. Yet no cheer rose, no immediate relief, for every senator, every guard, every servant who stood trembling in that corridor knew the blood of Caligula stained not just their hands, but their souls. They had killed the beast, but the memory of his reign, the nights, the banquets, the cries, the children torn away would haunt them long after the corpse grew cold. Rome awoke the next morning to a world without its god. Some rejoiced, others trembled at the void his death left behind. But beneath the cheers and cautious celebrations, a darker truth lingered though Caligula had fallen. The empire itself had tasted his madness, and no empire, once touched by such cruelty, ever truly returns to innocence. The corpse of Caligula was gone within hours, dragged into shallow earth as though Rome hoped that burying him quickly would bury the memory of his reign. Senators declared relief, priests blessed the city, and the people whispered prayers of gratitude. But the shadow did not vanish with his body. It lingered in corridors, in homes, in bloodlines. For the women, scars ran deeper than any proclamation of freedom. They returned from palaces with bellies swollen or bodies shattered, their eyes hollowed by nights they could never recount. Some carried children who bore the emperor's blood but would never bear his name. Others carried shame heavier than chains, unable to look at husbands who had stood helpless while torches illuminated their humiliation. The children of the breeding programs grew up under an unspoken curse, though Rome tried to fold them quietly into its legions, temples, and families. Whispers trailed them like shadows, sons of madness, daughters of desecration. Their existence was a reminder that cruelty could reproduce itself, that violence could take flesh. Many lived in silence, never knowing who their fathers truly were, only that their births had been written in ledgers rather than prayers. The Praetorians who had struck Caligula down did not walk free of ghosts. They had ended his tyranny with steel, but in doing so, they had confirmed the cycle of blood Rome could never escape. Power was not transferred. It was seized, soaked, and stained. Each man carried the memory of his screams, the image of a god unmade, and the chilling realization that Rome would demand the same of them again. Historians centuries later would debate Caligula: was he mad? Or merely a mirror of Rome's own appetites? Was he a monster singular? Or a symptom of an empire whose veins already pulsed with corruption? They argued over inscriptions, coins, and testimonies, but no marble relief, no senatorial decree, no official chronicle could capture the cries of women torn from their homes, the emptiness in families split apart, or the silence of children who grew up never knowing why their faces resembled a man everyone called a god. Even today, his name lives not as ruler, but as warning: Caligula. The syllables themselves are heavy, carrying centuries of fear and revulsion. His reign was brief, but it taught Rome and the world that civilization can rot from within, not from poverty or foreign swords, but from unchecked cruelty disguised as divine right. And so the shadow remained. It lingered in every empire that rose after Rome, in every palace where power towered above mercy. It whispers still, a reminder etched in the bones of history: when men are made gods, humanity becomes the sacrifice.